Harry Potter is one of my favorite movie franchises, and I wanted to see how closely I could create 3 different effects from that world. The effects that I chose to create start out pretty easy with the first one and then increase in difficulty after that. All of the effects I'm going to be showing you were created using After Effects. The last effect will be the Deluminator effect, which if you don't know what that effect is, it's the one where they use a magical device to remove light sources from an environment. This effect was the most involved, but I think it turned out pretty cool. So with that being said, let's jump right into the first effect, which is the Conjuration spell. So the first thing I did was think of an object I wanted to conjure up. I decided on this goblet I found on eBay for like $10. I wanted to go with something that looked like it was from the Harry Potter world, and I felt like this definitely fit that vibe. To film this effect, the first thing I did was tilt the goblet to the side and then let it go so that it wobbled a bit on the table before coming to a stop. That way it looked like it had some momentum while coming out of the spell. This part is pretty simple, but I think it's the most important step to making the effect work. Next, I recorded myself acting out the spell with a wand and then picked up the goblet. After that, I made sure to clear the frame and recorded a clean plate. Next, I brought my footage into After Effects and separated the footage into 3 layers. The clean plate on the bottom, above that will be me casting the spell, and then the shot of me tilting the goblet and letting it go was on the very top. So the first thing I did was create a mask on the spellcast layer to get rid of the goblet and made sure to also mask out its shadow. I also made sure to increase the feather of this mask so that the harsh line was not visible. Then I positioned the layer of the goblet tilting so that it appears right as I'm casting the spell with the wand, and I also made a mask on this layer so you can't see me tilting the goblet. After that, I went forward 1 frame on the goblet tilt layer, split it, then turned that single frame into a freeze frame and renamed it Goblet Twirl. I then moved the original goblet tilt layer forward by 5 frames. I then extended that freeze frame layer to be 5 frames as well to meet the goblet tilt layer. Next, I deleted the original mask on the goblet twirl layer and created a new one so that it was only around the goblet. This mask didn't need to be perfect since I'm going to add a twirl and blur effect to it later. So after that, I added the twirl effect to this layer. First, I brought the twirl center point to the middle of the goblet. Then I keyframed the angle of this effect to start at about 236 degrees at the beginning of the layer, then brought it down to 0 at the end. I also increased the twirl radius to 31. Next, I added the radial blur effect to this layer and keyframed the amount to start at 57 at the beginning and then brought it to 0 at the end. For the radial blur, I didn't put the center directly in the middle of the goblet. I left it a little off center because I liked the look of it more. Next, I needed to add on the shadow of the goblet once it appeared. So to do this, I duplicated the goblet tilt layer and renamed the top layer shadow. Then went to the point on this shadow layer where the goblet has stopped wobbling, split it at this point, and deleted the first part. Then I dragged that layer over to start at the same time as the goblet twirl layer and cut it so that it ends at the same time too. Then I deleted the original mask on this layer and made a new one only around the shadow of the goblet on the table. After that, I keyframed the opacity of this shadow layer to start at 0% and end at 100% at the end of the layer. Now the shadow of the goblet slowly fades in instead of abruptly appearing. Next, on the goblet tilt layer, I keyframed the opacity so that it goes from 100% when I begin reaching for the goblet to 0% right before my hand enters the mask on this layer. I then duplicated the spellcasting layer, and on the bottom layer, I deleted the mask off of it. I also trimmed this layer to start at the keyframe of when the goblet tilt layer's opacity starts to fade out. This way, that top layer with the mask seamlessly fades into the one without the mask so it looks like I pick it up all in one shot. Then I added in some sound effects and had the final effect. The second effect is Lumos, which is probably the most commonly used charm in all of Harry Potter. To shoot this effect, the first thing I did was bring a light close to what I was shooting so that the light turning on and lighting the scene was practical. I've always felt like having a real light illuminate your scene is an essential step to making an effect like this work. I use an Aputure B7c bulb, which I love because you can adjust the intensity of the light and also change the color very easily using Aputure's Sidus Link app. So I then filmed a shot of the Lumos charm being cast with a wand and then turned on the light at the same time. I then removed the light from the frame to get a clean plate so that I could easily remove the lamp in After Effects. In After Effects, I put the clean plate on the bottom and the wand shot on the top. I then created a mask around the lamp and changed the mode on this mask to subtract so that it was removed from the shot. Next, I tracked the tip of the wand with the built-in motion tracker inside of After Effects. It's useful to plan out the environment you'll be tracking your wand in and make sure that there's contrast between your background and the tip of your wand so that After Effects can track it more easily. I made sure to start the track right at the point that the light started turning on because that's when I wanted the light to start coming from the wand. After that was done tracking, I applied the motion to a null object. Next, I created a new black solid, called this flare, changed the blend mode to screen, and trimmed it so that it started right before the light bulb turns on. Then I added the lens flare effect to the solid and parented it to the null object. Inside of the lens flare effect, I brought the flare center to the tip of the wand, left the flare brightness at 100%, changed the lens type to 35mm prime, and increased the blend with original to 10%. I then created a mask around the flare so that I could have more control over the size of it. I didn't like how large the outer part was, so I made the mask a little bit smaller and shaped the flare to how I wanted it. I also increased the feather on this mask to 300. Next, I keyframed the opacity of the flare layer so that it starts at 0 and increases to 100% while the light is turning on. I also turned these keyframes into Easy Ease keyframes. I still wanted the size of the flare to be smaller, so I brought the overall scale of the layer down to about 62% and then repositioned the flare over the tip of the wand. Next, I added the glow effect to the flare solid layer. Inside of the glow effect, I changed the glow threshold to 0%, the glow radius to 450, the glow intensity to 0.5, and changed glow colors to A and B colors. That way, I was able to come down to color A and color B and change the color of the glow to what I wanted. I then added the fast box blur effect to the flare solid and increased the blur radius to 11 so that the overall glow wasn't as sharp. After that, I duplicated the flare solid layer and deleted the mask off of the bottom one. I also deleted the fast box blur and the glow effect from this same layer. Then I scaled this layer up pretty big to about 286% so that the main outer ring of the flare wasn't seen anymore. I did this instead of masking it out because I wanted to keep that bright look from the flare, but didn't want to see the harsh edge of the large part of the flare. I also made sure the flare center of this layer was back on the tip of the wand. Then I changed the flare brightness to 90% and blend with original to 65%. If I toggle that layer on and off, you can see what it adds to the shot. But yeah, then that was the final step for the Lumos effect. Now, like I said earlier, for the third and final effect, I'm going to be creating the Deluminator effect. The first thing I needed was a Deluminator prop. After searching and seeing that they were like $65 online, I decided to make my own since it was going to mostly be covered up by my hand and I wasn't going to be focusing on it too much. So yeah, not the best prop that I've made, but it works for what I needed. For shooting, I wanted to film in an area that looked somewhat like it was in a Harry Potter setting. So I found this terrace that had some cool looking medieval type of lights. Then I lit my scene with a couple of lights and used a haze machine to add some atmosphere. For the lighting fixtures, I got lucky because the lights were within reach and both of the lighting fixtures I wanted to use for the effect had an opening on the back. So I went ahead and used the Aputure B7c bulbs again and put those into the fixtures. Now, I didn't get permission for this and I wouldn't recommend going around changing bulbs out of public lights, but I was careful and put the original bulbs back in after I was done. If you're filming outside and don't have control over the lighting fixtures that you're going to be using, you can find one where the light is already off and use that, like maybe the bulb inside is burnt out or something like that. Then in that case, you would be able to follow the same steps I'm about to show, but you won't have the practical light interacting with your scene when it turns on and off. After replacing the bulbs with the B7Cs, I simply acted out the motion of using the Deluminator to turn off the lights, and had someone using the Link app to turn the lights off at the same time. I filmed these shots handheld, so they did require motion tracking inside of After Effects. Inside of After Effects, the first thing I did was track the footage. I used a couple of the tips on the bottom of the lights as tracking points. After Effects loses the track after the lights turn off, but that was fine because I'll animate the light orb to move once the light turns off anyway. So after that was finished tracking, I applied the tracking data to a null object. Then I created a new solid and called it Light Orb. On this solid, I added the effect CC Particle Systems 2, and this effect is going to be the main part of the light orb. Inside of the Particle Systems effect, I changed the birth rate to 6 and the longevity to 0.4 seconds. In the producer settings, I changed the radius X to 0.8 and the radius Y to 1.2. Then under the physics settings, I changed the animation to direction normalized and put everything else to 0. In the particle settings, I changed the particle type to faded sphere, the birth size to 0.60, the depth size to 0, size variation to 7.5%, opacity map to fade in and out, max opacity to 10%, and checked the source alpha inheritance box. I also changed the birth and death color to match the color temperature of the light bulb, which was more warm and tungsten, and I'll do this at the end after I add the glow to my effect and some color grading. So I just ended up setting them to white for now. Now scrubbing through this, you can see the particle effect moving around a bit, but after adding some glow effects and a blur to this, you won't be able to see it moving like that. After that, I added the drop shadow effect to this solid and left all of the settings alone. Next, I added the glow effect to the light orb solid and changed the glow radius to 215, and then left all of the other settings the same. I then duplicated this glow layer so that the glow was more filled out. I also added the fast box blur effect to this and increased the blur radius to 20 so that the edges of the orb weren't as sharp. After I got the look of the light and the glow to how I wanted it, I adjusted the scale and position of the overall light orb layer so that it covered up the bulb inside of the fixture. I also shifted this layer to the left a few frames in the timeline so that the particle system's effect is already on when my scene starts. If you don't do this, there is a bit of a delay for when the effect turns on since it's a particle system. After I had the light orb positioned where I wanted it, I parented that layer to the main light null, and now the orb was tracked into my scene. Now that I had the look of the main light orb, the next thing I did was create that small swirling ball of light that turns on once the Deluminator is activated. So to do that, I duplicated the light orb layer and called the new layer Deluminator Tip Orb. Then I trimmed this layer to start right when my arm was coming down. I also scaled this orb down a bit to be a little bit smaller on the Deluminator. I brought mine down to 45%, and I also adjusted this layer's position so that it was lined up on the top of the Deluminator tip. I also set the parent and link setting on this layer to none. Next, inside of the CC particle systems effect on this layer, I went into the particle settings and created keyframes so that the max opacity started at 0% at the beginning of this layer, went forward 5 frames, and increased it to 40%. I also changed the birth rate on this effect to 4, the longevity to 0.6, and inside of the particle settings, changed the birth size to 0.16. And I changed the blur radius setting inside of the fast box blur effect to 15 so that it wasn't as blurry for this orb. Next, I added the fractal noise effect to this layer and changed the fractal type to turbulent smooth, set the contrast to 250, the brightness to 10, the complexity to 1.3, and the opacity to 25%. Then I keyframed the evolution to start at 0 at the beginning of the layer and increased it to 4 at the end. I then keyframed the position of this light orb to stay on the tip of the Deluminator throughout the clip. And I left this orb on for any part of the effect where the Deluminator was supposed to be activated. Last thing I did for this light orb was create a lens flare to make it brighter. So I created a new black solid, called it Deluminator Tip Flare, and added the lens flare effect to this. Then I set the layer's blend mode to screen and trimmed it to start right as the orb starts to appear. I changed the lens type to 105mm prime and set the blend with original to 60%. Then I keyframed the flare brightness to start at 0% at the beginning of the layer, went forward 5 frames and increased it to 20%. I also keyframed the flare center and adjusted the position to stay over the light orb while it's visible. Then I created a circular mask around the flare so that it only included the middle part of it. Then I increased the feather of this mask to 180 and animated the mask path so that the mask stays around the flare as it moves. Now I have that swirling light orb on the Deluminator. Next, I needed to animate the main light orb to move from the lamp to the Deluminator. So to do this, I opened up the position of the null object of the main light and deleted the keyframes after the light turned off. Then I started at that last keyframe, went forward 5 frames, and adjusted the position of the null object so that the orb moved to the tip of the Deluminator. I also tweaked these 2 position keyframes to have a slight curve so that the light orb doesn't travel in a completely straight line. Next, I keyframed the scale of the orb to decrease while going from the light to the Deluminator. So I made a keyframe for the scale right as it starts moving away from the lamp. Then I decreased it to about 33% right as it got to the Deluminator. Then I went forward 6 frames and increased the scale to 45%. This will help it look like there's a flash of light once the orb arrives. I then manually adjusted the position of the null object over the course of about 15 frames, starting when it first arrived so that the light orb was always on the tip of the Deluminator. I also layered the main light orb on top of the smaller one and the lens flare layers so that it covers them up after arriving at the Deluminator. I also made sure to turn on motion blur for the composition and the light orb layer so that it had natural motion blur while traveling through the air. Next, I made the orb turn off and disappear after arriving at the Deluminator. For that, I opened up the particle system settings and on the main orb layer, came down to max opacity. I created a keyframe at the point right after the orb gets to the Deluminator and then went forward 9 frames and brought it to 0%. It will take a few more frames to completely turn off since I set the longevity to 0.4 seconds. Since the orb decreased in size as it was turning off, I made sure to go through and adjust the position of the null one more time so that the orb stayed on the tip of the Deluminator. Next, I added a flash of light for when the orb arrives at the Deluminator. And to do this is similar to how I created the lens flare light for the Deluminator tip light orb. I created a new black solid, named this main light orb flare, and set the blend mode to screen. Then I trimmed that layer so that it started right when the orb arrived at the Deluminator. Next, I added the lens flare effect to this layer and decreased the scale of this layer to 45%. Then I changed the lens type to 35mm prime and positioned this layer so that the main part of the flare was over the orb. Then I keyframed the flare center to be over the light orb for about 15 frames. Then I created a mask inside of the flare that was slightly smaller than the first ring and feathered this mask to 400. I also set the opacity of the layer to 40%. I keyframed this mask so that for 4 frames it stayed the same and wouldn't show that first ring of the flare. Then on the 5th frame, I increased the size of it slightly, so now it included that first ring. Then I went forward 9 frames from this point and animated the mask path so that it stayed around the orb while it moved. I did this so that when the flash of light happens, it has a pulsing kind of effect. After that, I keyframed the blend with original of the lens flare to start at 100% at the beginning of the layer, went forward 3 frames and brought it to 0%. Then went forward about 10 frames and brought it back to 100% so it fades out at the same time as the light orb. I also added the glow effect to this flare layer and changed the glow threshold to 3%, the glow radius to 385, and the glow intensity to 0.3. Now I had a flash of light that happened as the orb arrived at the Deluminator. And now at this point, the effect is looking pretty cool. Next thing I did was make part of the wall and my hand light up when this flash of light happened so that it seemed like the effect was interacting with the environment. A quick way to do this was to duplicate the main footage layer and bring that duplicated layer to the top of the composition, renamed it Environment Glow, then I changed the blend mode to Add and trimmed it to start when the orb arrives at the Deluminator. I also added a few masks on this layer where I wanted the glow to happen, like here on the wall and a bit on my hand. I also increased the feather on those masks to 500 for the wall and 100 for my hand. Then I keyframed the mask path to stay on those areas for only a few frames while the flash of light happened. I also brought the opacity of both of these masks down to 70% and then keyframed the opacity of the entire layer to start at 0% right as the light orb arrives at the Deluminator, went forward a few frames until the flash of light was at its brightest and increased the opacity to 25%, then went forward and decreased it to 0% as the light orb fades out. Now there's some environmental glow when the light orb flashes. Next, since the lighting fixture I used had a part of the lamp in front of the light bulb, I had to mask around this to hide the light behind it. For that, I duplicated my main footage layer and moved that duplicated layer to the top of my composition. Then I created a mask on this layer around the part of the lamp that was blocking the light and feathered it a bit. I also added the curves effect to this and increased the midtones and shadows a bit so that it blended in better with the rest of the lamp. After that, I keyframed the mask to stay over this part the entire time the light was on inside of the lamp. I also faded this layer's opacity to 0% as the light turned off. Then I duplicated the main light orb layer, renamed this layer Light Streaks, and then trimmed it to be only the length of when the orb is traveling from the light to the Deluminator. I also changed the opacity of this layer to 25% and reset the scale and set it to 30%. Then I added the turbulent displace effect to this layer and changed the amount to 600 and the size to 50. Then I offset the position of this layer so that it was slightly behind the main light orb. I also slightly stretched this layer horizontally and squeezed it vertically to get a more stretched and streaky look to it. I also keyframed the position so I could tweak it for each frame and line it up with the main light orb better. Then I keyframed the evolution and the offset turbulence and randomly adjusted these for each of the frames while the light orb was moving through the air until I had the look I wanted for each one, which was pretty much just random light streaks trailing behind the orb. Since this is only on screen for a few frames and will have motion blur, it didn't have to be anything too specific. I also added the mesh warp effect to this layer and keyframed the distortion mesh so that I could bend and distort it even more until I had the look I wanted on each frame. Then the last thing I did for the trail of light was create a new solid, called it Saber, made it the same length as the light orb turbulent displace layer, and changed the blend mode to screen. Then I drew 2 curved lines on this solid that were coming out of the back of the orb with the pen tool, and keyframed them to move with it as it moved through the air. Then I added the Saber effect from Video Copilot to this solid. This is a plugin that I've been using since like 2016, and I highly recommend downloading it if you haven't already. It comes in handy for a lot of different effects, and the best part about it is it's completely free. I'll leave a link for that in the description. So after that, I came into the Saber settings and under the Customize Core tab, changed the core type to Layer Masks. Then I changed the preset to Ghostbuster, the glow color to match the color of the orb, and changed the glow intensity to 16%. And now the main light orb has more defined light trails that are following behind it as it's traveling through the air. The very last thing I did for this effect was, since I had a shot where I closed the cap of the Deluminator, I masked around the cap as it was closing so it makes the ball of light disappear. Alright, so that last one was a bit long, but I really like how it turned out, so here is the finished Deluminator effect. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. I know it has been a good long while since I last uploaded, but I'm feeling rejuvenated and ready to be making content again. I'm already working on my next video, which I'm planning on releasing in a few weeks. My goal is to finally post consistently and not take a long break like that again anytime soon. So for those of you who are still watching, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your support, and hey, follow me on Instagram because I'm going to start posting behind the scenes stuff while I make more YouTube videos. So I promise I will see you guys soon.